Duke Alistair dismissed his wife from the Ashcombe Grain Exchange before 300 tenants, accusing her of falsifying accounts and driving up the price of bread. By sunset, Duchess Frances had lost the warehouses she established with her dowry, the ledgers she maintained for 11 years, and the authority that had kept 6 villages fed through failed harvests. Alistair placed the exchange in the hands of Sir Malcolm Vane, a political ally who promised enormous profits from grain speculation. Frances did not plead. Supported by her wealthy merchant family, she withdrew every wagon, barge, and line of credit registered under her marriage settlement. Within days, Ashcombe's granaries stood full, while its tenants starved, because Vane was secretly diverting grain to foreign buyers. Then, hundreds of villagers marched toward London, carrying empty sacks, marked with the Duke's crest. Before they reached the palace, Frances discovered Alistair's signature on contracts that could cost him his estates, and perhaps his title. 3 days earlier, the accusation had begun with a missing page. Frances stood beneath the timber rafters of the Ashcombe Grain Exchange while millers, carters, warehouse clerks, and tenant farmers crowded around the weighing floor. Open sacks of wheat rested beside overturned baskets. Above them, on the raised platform, Alistair held the principal ledger in one hand. Sir Malcolm Vane stood at his side in an immaculate blue coat, one gloved hand resting upon a silver-headed cane. "These accounts show that 1,200 bushels disappeared under my wife's authority," Alistair announced. While the county struggled to afford bread, Duchess Frances concealed grain and falsified the exchange records. A murmur passed through the crowd. Frances looked toward the counting table. Her chief clerk, Mr. Bell, stood between 2 estate guards. Blood darkened the corner of his mouth. The adjoining authorization had been present when Frances examined the ledger that morning. Those 1,200 bushels were released to the northern villages after the October floods, she said. The delivery order is recorded on the next page. Alistair turned the ledger toward her. The page had been cut away. Frances saw fresh fibers along the binding. Whoever removed it had done so recently and with a sharp blade. "The page is missing," Alistair said. "It was removed, conveniently, after the grain vanished." The grain did not vanish. Every cart was witnessed upon arrival. Ask the northern millers. Vane descended 1 step from the platform. Perhaps Her Grace can explain why so much grain was moved without her husband's permission. "Because it was purchased through the protected portion of my dowry. My marriage settlement gives its trustees authority to release emergency reserves. Property brought into a marriage belongs to the husband, not when it is held in trust." Vane's smile faltered. Only for an instant, but Frances saw it. She looked back at Alistair. "Have you examined the contracts Sir Malcolm brought you?" "I have signed them. That was not my question." Several workers turned toward the Duke. Alistair's face hardened. 3 nights earlier, Frances had warned him that Vane's proposal required Ashcombe to sell more grain than the estate could safely release. The promised profit was enormous, but so were the penalties for failing to meet the deliveries. Vane had also promised to secure political support for Alistair in London. Frances had asked for 1 week to examine the buyers, the quantities, and the unexplained collateral listed in the schedules. Alistair had interpreted her caution as an attempt to embarrass him. Now, before 300 witnesses, he had the opportunity to pause. He could order the damaged ledger examined. He could question why Bell had been struck. He could demand evidence from the northern villages before condemning his wife. Instead, he held out his hand. "You will surrender the exchange keys. Sir Malcolm will assume control immediately." Frances studied the man she had married. She understood then that Alistair had not summoned the tenants to discover the truth. He had gathered them to prove that Ashcombe obeyed him rather than her. She removed the iron ring from her waist. 7 keys struck one another in the silence. Alistair waited with his hand extended. Frances placed the keys on the floor between them. "If you want what I built," she said, "bend down and take it." No one moved. For one brief moment, uncertainty crossed Alistair's face. He could still refuse the humiliation Vane had arranged for her. He could still choose the wife who had protected his tenants over the man flattering his ambition. Then he bent down. That choice ended their marriage more completely than any court ever could. Frances turned toward the workers. "You have been told that I stole food from your families. I will answer that accusation before magistrates who have not borrowed money from Sir Malcolm Vane." Vane's cane struck the boards. "Take care, Your Grace." "I did," Frances replied, "for 11 years. That is why this exchange survived." She walked out without requesting her husband's permission. Her lady's maid, Clara, waited beside the carriage with a cloak and a frightened expression. "His Grace ordered the household servants not to assist you. Then we shall not trouble them. Where will we go?" "To my father's counting-house in London." Before entering the carriage, Frances stopped beside Matthew Hale, the transport foreman. 6 wagons stood outside the largest warehouse, each marked with a sheaf of wheat enclosed by a circle, the Harcourt trading seal. "Who owns those wagons?" she asked. "Your settlement trust, Your Grace. And the river barges? 4 belong to the trust. 2 are leased by the exchange. The insurance guarantees covering shipments from these warehouses, underwritten through your father's firm." Frances looked back through the open doors. Vane was already standing at her counting table and issuing orders to workers who had not yet decided whether to obey him. "At midnight, withdraw every wagon and barge belonging to my settlement. Suspend the guarantees on all shipments made under Ashcombe's name until an independent audit is completed." Hale stared at her. "His Grace has promised deliveries beginning tomorrow. Then His Grace should have determined what he owned before giving it away." She instructed Hale to keep 2 wagons available for emergency flour deliveries. The tenants would not starve merely because Alistair had chosen pride over judgment. Inside the carriage, Frances opened her writing case and composed 3 letters. 1 to her father, 1 to the trustees of her marriage settlement, and 1 to Magistrate Henry Talbot. Clara watched Ashcombe disappear behind them. "Will the Duke come after you?" "Yes." "How can you be certain?" "Because by tomorrow morning he will possess warehouses full of grain and no lawful means of moving a single sack." At dawn, Alistair discovered that every Harcourt wagon had vanished. The barges were chained on the opposite bank. The insurers refused to guarantee his shipments. Millers rejected notes issued under Vane's authority, and hired carters demanded payment in advance because Ashcombe's credit had been suspended. Sir Malcolm placed a stack of temporary transport orders before him. "Sign these, and the difficulty will be resolved." Alistair glanced at the first page. "What are the revised penalties?" "A formality. Your wife expects you to hesitate." That was enough. Alistair signed without reading the schedules attached beneath it. By noon, unfamiliar wagons began removing grain from the western warehouse. Vane told the workers the shipment was bound for villages suffering shortages. It was not. Concealed inside the first driver's dispatch case was a customs permit for the coast, and an agreement requiring Ashcombe to deliver nearly every bushel remaining in its granaries within 21 days. If the Duke failed, the buyers would claim the income of 3 villages as collateral. At the bottom of every page appeared Alistair's unmistakable signature, but the final clause contained something even he had not been told. If Ashcombe defaulted twice, the creditors could petition the Crown to place the entire estate under financial supervision, stripping the Duke of the authority he had sacrificed his wife to defend. Frances reached her father's London counting-house the following afternoon. Thomas Harcourt had already received her letters and summoned the trustees named in her marriage settlement. They confirmed that Alistair possessed no lawful authority over the Harcourt wagons, barges, or commercial guarantees. The protected capital Frances had brought into the marriage remained under the trustees' control, even though the warehouses carrying the Ashcombe crest stood on her husband's land. Maintain the suspension, Frances instructed, but release enough grain through independent depots to supply the 6 villages. Thomas studied her. You intend to feed Alistair's tenants after he accused you of starving them. They are not responsible for what he chose to do. She also requested copies of every Harcourt delivery receipt issued during the October floods. If the missing ledger page could not be recovered, the millers and carters who received the 1,200 bushels could still prove where the grain had gone. Her younger brother, Edward, entered with a list of vehicles hired under Ashcombe's name. Vane found 22 wagons, he said. They left the western warehouse this morning. Which road did they take? East. The northern villages lay in the opposite direction. Frances examined the hiring records. Vane had paid the drivers in advance through Cresswell Bank, the same institution that held Alistair's private debts. Every wagon was scheduled to continue toward the coast. He is exporting the reserves, she said, at a time when local prices are already rising, Thomas replied. If he empties the warehouses, the villages will be forced to buy grain back at whatever price he demands. Edward pointed to the quantities. These are only the first shipments. The contract requires far more. Frances understood why Vane had needed her removed. She would never have authorized the sale of the emergency reserves, and the trustees would never have insured such a reckless venture. "Can we stop the wagons?" Edward asked. "Not until we establish which grain was purchased by my trust and which belongs to Ashcombe." The missing page recorded that division. A clerk delivered a message from the estate. It contained only 5 words. "Bell has been taken from Ashcombe." Frances read it twice. Her chief clerk knew the exchange accounts better than anyone except her. If Vane had removed him immediately after taking control, then Bell had discovered more than a missing authorization. "Find out where he was taken," she told Edward, quietly. "Vane must believe I am occupied with the trustees." Meanwhile, Alistair received the first formal notice from Cresswell Bank. The document stated that Ashcombe's transport guarantees had failed and that additional security was now required. Beneath the notice was a schedule listing the future rents of 3 villages. Alistair summoned Vane to the library. "You told me the villages were temporary collateral against the grain deliveries." "They are. This notice gives Cresswell authority to collect their rents if we miss a single payment. Then we will not miss one. We do not possess enough wagons to complete the contract. We have hired replacements." At twice the ordinary rate, Vane showed no concern. "A temporary expense. Once the grain reaches the foreign buyers, your profit will cover the transport, your debts, and the political support you require in London." Alistair looked again at the schedule. Frances would have noticed the clause before signing. She would also have asked why Cresswell Bank was connected to an export agreement supposedly arranged by Vane's private buyers, but admitting that would mean acknowledging why he had refused to let her examine the contracts. "Continue the shipments," he said. By evening, the price of flour in Ashcombe had nearly doubled. Millers who had relied upon the exchange were told they must now purchase grain at Vane's revised rate. Several refused. Others lacked the money. Families began gathering outside the estate gates with empty bowls, demanding the return of the reserves Frances had protected. Alistair ordered the gates closed. Vane advised him to collect every overdue rent before the tenants organized against him. "You cannot reward disobedience with leniency," he said. Alistair authorized the collections. The following morning, Frances opened 2 relief depots using supplies purchased through her father's firm. Flour would be distributed by village clergy and recorded in the presence of independent witnesses. No Ashcombe seal would appear on the deliveries. She was reviewing the first October receipts when Clara arrived from the estate. "Mr. Bell escaped before Vane's men reached the main road," she said. "A miller is hiding him outside the southern village. His arm is injured, but he is alive. Did he send anything?" Clara placed a small brass key on the desk. "He said the missing grain was recorded twice, once as delivered to the flooded villages and again under the names of abandoned farms. For what purpose? He would not explain in writing. He said Vane was searching for a second ledger hidden inside the old exchange scale." Frances compared the abandoned farm names with the shipments Edward had traced toward the coast. Someone had used properties with no active tenants to create deliveries that had never occurred, then sold the same grain again. The 1,200 bushels had never disappeared. They had been made to exist twice on paper, and every false entry carried authorization issued under the authority Alistair had just handed to Sir Malcolm Vane. Frances did not send anyone to steal the second ledger. If it appeared in her possession, Vane could accuse her of fabricating it. Instead, she gave Bell's key to Magistrate Talbot and requested a witnessed inspection of the exchange scale. Talbot agreed to examine the compartment the following morning. He also sent a clerk to record Bell's sworn testimony at the mill. Once the statement entered a magistrate's record, Vane could no longer silence Bell without drawing greater suspicion. Meanwhile, Frances began reconstructing the missing accounts from independent documents. The northern millers supplied receipts confirming that they had received 1,200 bushels after the October floods. Each receipt carried the date, quantity, driver's name, and Harcourt transport mark. The carters' records matched them exactly. The grain Alistair had accused her of stealing had been delivered lawfully. But Bell's list showed the same quantities entered a second time under 6 abandoned farms. Those false deliveries had been approved through a company called Eastern Provision. Edward searched the London merchant registers. "No company exists under that name," he reported. "But its payments passed through Cresswell Bank, the same bank that held Alistair's debts." Frances compared the false farm entries with the new export shipments. The quantities matched. Vane had recorded grain as delivered to farms where no one lived, then sold that same grain to foreign buyers. Ashcombe appeared to possess more reserves than it truly held, allowing Vane to promise deliveries the estate could not complete. "He intends the contract to fail," Frances said. Thomas looked at the schedule pledging the 3 villages. "Why would he prefer default to profit?" "That is what we must discover." At Ashcombe, Magistrate Talbot arrived with 2 witnesses and a written request to inspect records connected to Frances's settlement. Vane could not refuse without appearing to conceal evidence. Bell's key opened a brass plate behind the old weighing scale. The compartment was empty, but fresh scratches marked the screws, and ledger dust remained along the inner shelf. Someone had removed the book after Frances left. Talbot sealed the compartment and recorded its condition. It was not the proof Frances needed, but it confirmed Bell's description and showed that Vane had known where to search. When Alistair learned of the inspection, he confronted Vane. "Where is the second ledger? Bell invented it to protect your wife. Then why was the compartment opened? Perhaps Frances removed the book before leaving. She did not know it existed." Vane placed another transport order before him. "Every hour spent questioning me brings Cresswell closer to claiming your villages. Sign this, and we may still fulfill the first delivery." Alistair read only the quantity. Then he signed. The order released another portion of Ashcomb's emergency reserves. That evening, the first relief wagons sent by Frances reached the villages. Flour was distributed at the former exchange price, with every quantity witnessed and recorded. At the same time, Vane's agents announced that grain purchased through Ashcombe would now cost nearly twice as much. The contrast was immediate. Families began refusing the Duke's notes and taking their business to the Harcourt depots. Alistair blamed Frances for turning his tenants against him. The Dowager Duchess answered him plainly. "She did not double the price of their bread. You did." In London, Edward returned with property maps for every abandoned farm named in Bell's list. Frances placed the 6 farms beside the 3 villages pledged in Alistair's contracts. Together, they formed an unbroken corridor from Ashcombe's eastern boundary to the river. Thomas examined the map. "These properties are nearly worthless." "They are worthless now," Frances said. A Harcourt clerk then produced a confidential notice obtained from a surveyor's office. The government was considering a commercial canal through the county. The proposed route crossed every farm listed in Vane's false accounts. Once announced, the land would become several times more valuable. Frances finally understood the scheme. Vane was exporting the reserves to raise local grain prices. Families unable to buy food or pay rent would fall into debt. Eastern Provision would acquire their farms through Cresswell Bank before the canal route became public. The grain contracts were never meant to enrich Alistair. They were designed to make him default, strip his tenants of their land, and leave Vane controlling the only valuable corridor through Ashcombe. At the bottom of the survey notice was the date of the government's announcement. 7 days remained. Frances sent copies of the canal survey, the false farm entries, and the October delivery receipts to Magistrate Talbot. The documents revealed a pattern, but they did not yet prove that Vane controlled Eastern Provision. For that, she needed the original bank agreements or testimony from someone inside Cresswell. She could not wait for the investigation before protecting the villages. Using Harcourt credit, Frances purchased grain from 2 neighboring counties and expanded the relief network. Each depot posted its prices publicly and recorded every distribution before independent witnesses. She wanted no one to accuse her of concealing supplies again. Vane responded by ordering Ashcombe's millers to buy exclusively from the Duke's exchange at the higher rate. Those who refused were threatened with the loss of their leases. Most continued buying from Frances. Within 2 days, more than 100 tenants gathered outside Ashcombe Hall, carrying empty sacks and flour bowls. Matthew Hale presented their demands. Restore Duchess Frances to the exchange, withdraw the accusation against her, and stop the export shipments. Alistair stood before the closed gates, with Vane beside him. "The exchange is my property," he said. "Its management is not a matter for tenant negotiation." "Children cannot eat your title," Hale replied. Vane advised Alistair to evict the men leading the protest. The Dowager Duchess opposed him before the order could be issued. "If you remove one family for asking for bread," she warned, Every village will know you value Vane's contracts more than your own people." Alistair knew the accusation was true enough to damage him, yet restoring Frances would require admitting that he had condemned her without proof. "I will permit Magistrate Talbot to review the accounts," he announced. "Until his inquiry is complete, Sir Malcolm remains in charge." A woman raised an empty bowl. "Will the inquiry feed us tonight?" Alistair gave no answer. The tenants left without bowing. Before dispersing, Hale announced that they would wait 3 days. If the export shipments continued, they would carry their empty sacks to London and petition the government for an investigation into Ashcombe. Afterward, Alistair confronted Vane. "You said the first foreign payment would arrive by now. It has been delayed. Cresswell is demanding another installment, and the tenants refuse our grain. Because your wife is financing their defiance. She is selling flour below your price. She is using her father's wealth to destroy your authority." Alistair looked at the latest inventory. More than a third of the emergency reserves had already left Ashcombe, yet the exchange had received no foreign payment. "Show me the buyer's correspondence." Vane closed the ledger. "That information is commercially sensitive. I am the Duke of Ashcombe, and you are bound by contracts you signed. If the deliveries stop now, Cresswell will claim the village rents immediately." For the first time, Alistair understood that dismissing Frances had not placed the exchange under his control. It had placed him under Vane's. In London, Frances received a sworn statement from Bell. He confirmed that Vane had ordered the double entries weeks before taking charge of the exchange. Bell had objected, and Vane had threatened to accuse him of helping Frances conceal the missing grain. Bell also remembered one detail absent from the false ledger. Eastern Provisions payment instructions used a reference number beginning with the initials MV. Edward wanted to publish the canal scheme immediately. "Not yet," Frances said. "If we reveal what we know, Vane will destroy the contracts connecting him to the company. Then how do we obtain them? We make Cresswell protect itself." Frances sent the bank a formal notice stating that Ashcombe's grain contracts might have been secured through false inventories and property belonging to her settlement. If Cresswell continued collecting against the villages after receiving that warning, its directors could no longer claim ignorance. The bank replied the next morning. It denied knowledge of Eastern Provisions ownership, but agreed to send an officer to inspect Ashcombe's remaining reserves. Until that inspection was complete, no village could be seized. The decision gave the tenants time, but it also threatened Vane's entire plan. That afternoon, another convoy prepared to leave the western warehouse. Alistair arrived before the wagons departed and ordered the doors closed. Vane produced the latest transport authorization. It bore Alistair's signature. "You cannot stop a shipment you approved yourself," he said. Alistair examined the page. The signature was genuine, but the destination and quantity had been added afterward. Frances had warned him about the incomplete schedules. He had signed them anyway. Outside the warehouse, the tenants began assembling with their empty sacks. 3 days had passed. At sunrise, they would march toward London, and this time Frances intended to walk beside them. At sunrise, nearly 300 tenants left Ashcombe carrying empty grain sacks marked with the Duke's crest. Frances walked at the front beside Matthew Hale. Their purpose was peaceful. They would present the sacks, the inflated bread prices, and their eviction threats as evidence that Ashcombe's management had endangered the villages. Before the procession reached the county road, a messenger arrived from Alistair. The Duke requested that Frances return to the hall immediately. "He ordered you out before everyone," Hale said. "Now he summons you in private." "I am not returning alone." Frances brought Hale, Magistrate Talbot, and 2 tenant representatives with her. Alistair objected when they entered the library. "You asked to speak with me," Frances said. "You did not earn the right to decide who witnesses it." Alistair placed the incomplete transport authorization on the table. "Vane added the destination and quantity after I signed. You gave him permission to do so when you signed a blank schedule. I was told the details would be entered after the inventory, and you accepted that because he promised to pay your debts and secure influence in London." Alistair did not deny it. Frances unfolded the canal map and showed him the abandoned farms, the pledged villages, and the proposed route to the river. "Vane is using the grain shortage to force these families into default. Eastern Provision will acquire their land before the canal is announced." "I knew nothing about a canal." "You knew the contracts were incomplete. You knew 1,200 bushels might have been delivered lawfully. You removed me because I was the only person preventing you from signing." Alistair looked at Talbot. "Can the contracts be cancelled?" "Not merely because you failed to read them," the magistrate replied. "We must prove fraud or concealed ownership." "What does Frances want?" She answered for herself. "Immediate suspension of every export shipment. No eviction or rent seizure while Talbot investigates. Full access to the estate accounts, correspondence, and warehouse inventories. And if I agree, I will ask the tenants to pause their journey for 24 hours while Cresswell's officer examines the reserves. Stop them entirely. No, I will protect the villages. Do not mistake that for protecting you." Alistair signed the 3 orders. He then instructed the exchange guards to refuse any shipment not witnessed by Talbot or his clerk. It was the first decision he had made against Vane, but it came only after his own property was threatened. Frances returned to the Marchers and explained the agreement. The tenants agreed to wait until the bank inspection was complete. They remained together on the county road, keeping their empty sacks in view. Cresswell's officer reached Ashcombe that afternoon. He compared the warehouse inventory with the quantities promised in Alistair's contracts. The figures did not match. More grain had been pledged than Ashcombe had ever possessed. Vane attempted to blame Frances's emergency deliveries, but she produced the October receipts, proving that those 1,200 bushels had been distributed before the export agreements were signed. The officer then examined the false entries assigned to abandoned farms. "These deliveries cannot have occurred," he said. "2 of these farms have been unoccupied for 4 years. Talbot asked who had submitted the entries to Cresswell. The officer opened the bank's correspondence file. "Eastern Provision. Who owns the company?" "That information is contained in the original lending agreement." "Where is it?" The officer searched the file again. The agreement was missing. Only a removal slip remained. It showed that the document had been taken from Cresswell's Ashcombe file 2 days earlier under the authority of Sir Malcolm Vane. Alistair ordered the estate searched, but Vane had already left. So had the second ledger, several boxes of correspondence, and the seal Alistair had allowed him to use. A rider reported seeing Vane's carriage heading toward London. The canal announcement was now 6 days away, and Vane was carrying the only original contract that could prove who truly owned Eastern Provision. Frances did not pursue Vane's carriage. The missing agreement was important, but no responsible bank relied upon a single copy of a secured contract. She traveled to Cresswell's London office with Thomas, Edward, Magistrate Talbot, and the bank officer who had inspected Ashcombe. Alistair followed separately. The tenants resumed their march. Frances asked them to proceed peacefully and preserve every eviction notice, flour bill, and unpaid grain note as evidence. At Cresswell, The directors initially refused to reveal a client's ownership records. Thomas responded by placing the October receipts and canal map before them. "Your bank has financed a company using false inventories to acquire land from starving tenants," he said. "You may assist the magistrate now, or explain your silence during the public inquiry that will follow." The directors permitted Talbot to examine their deed register. The original lending agreement was missing from Ashcomb's file, but its registration entry remained. Eastern Provision had been created 6 months earlier. Sir Malcolm Vane held authority to borrow, purchase distressed farms, and transfer the properties to a private investment group after the canal announcement. 2 Cresswell officials had witnessed the arrangement. More importantly, the register showed that the 3 Ashcombe villages were added as collateral only after Alistair signed the incomplete schedules. Vane had filled in the property names later. Alistair read the entry. "Then the pledge is invalid." "Possibly," Talbot said, "but your signature gave him the appearance of authority. The matter must be examined formally. I did not authorize him to seize villages. You authorized him to complete documents you had not read." The distinction prevented Alistair from presenting himself as another innocent victim. A clerk then brought correspondence received that morning. Vane had written to Cresswell claiming that Alistair had created Eastern Provision to conceal speculative profits. According to him, Frances discovered the scheme only after demanding a larger share. "He intends to make us responsible for everything," Alistair said. Frances examined the letter. Vane's accusation was plausible because Alistair had publicly declared that she falsified the accounts. He had created the lie Vane now intended to use against both of them. "You gave him his defense," Frances said. 300 people heard you accuse me without presenting proof." Alistair offered no answer. Talbot secured certified copies of the deed register, Vane's correspondence, and the bank's payment records. They established concealed ownership, false collateral, and a direct financial motive for creating the grain shortage. But the second ledger remained missing. Without it, Vane could still argue that Bell and Frances had invented the double entries. Bell solved part of that problem. Brought safely to London under Talbot's protection, he identified the handwriting of the assistant clerk who had copied Vane's orders into the exchange books. The clerk, Samuel Pike, had disappeared from Ashcombe on the same day as Vane. Cresswell's records showed that Pike had received 3 payments from Eastern Provision. One payment had been collected that morning at a banking office near Westminster. "He is still in London," Edward said. "And Vane needs him," Frances replied. "Pike is the only clerk who can claim the false entries were made under Alistair's instructions." Talbot circulated a lawful request for Pike to appear and give evidence. He also submitted the records to the government office responsible for reviewing the canal proposal. By afternoon, Alistair's political supporters had learned of the investigation. The promised appointment disappeared, invitations were withdrawn, and Cresswell suspended his private credit. Then a formal order arrived requiring him to surrender the Ashcombe account books for examination. Until the inquiry concluded, he could not sell land, remove additional grain, or pledge estate income. The authority he had tried to prove before his tenants was being taken from him one signature at a time. Before sunset, Samuel Pike presented himself to Magistrate Talbot. He was frightened but unharmed. "I will testify," he said, "if I am protected from Sir Malcolm." Talbot agreed to request protection, but Pike added one condition. He would speak only after Frances answered a question. Pike placed a page from the second ledger on the table. It contained the false deliveries, the Eastern Provision reference numbers, and a notation in Vane's hand. Beside the 1,200 bushels appeared one final instruction: removed by order of the Duchess of Ashcombe. "Sir Malcolm says you knew about the false accounts from the beginning," Pike said. "Tell me why your name is written here." Frances examined the notation. The words were genuine, but Vane had removed them from their original context. "On the 17th of October, I ordered 1,200 bushels removed from the exchange's available stock," she explained. "They were reserved for the flooded villages." The same instruction appears in the Harcourt Dispatch book. Edward produced the duplicate transport order. It listed the northern millers, the wagon numbers, and the quantities delivered. Pike compared both documents. "Then removed" did not mean stolen. It meant the grain could no longer be offered for sale, Frances said. Vane copied the phrase into the second ledger after deleting its destination. Pike admitted that Vane had instructed him to record the same grain under abandoned farms. He had been told the entries were temporary adjustments that would be corrected after the export payments arrived. "Did the Duke order you to make them?" Talbot asked. "No, Sir Malcolm gave every instruction." "Did Duchess Frances know?" "No, Sir Malcolm said she had to be removed before the full quantities were entered because she would refuse the contracts." Pike had kept the torn page as protection after learning that Vane intended to blame the exchange clerks. He did not possess the entire ledger, but his testimony connected Vane directly to the false accounts. Talbot recorded the statement and secured the page. The evidence now established that Frances had delivered the missing grain lawfully and that Vane had created duplicate entries to support contracts Ashcombe could never fulfill. It did not absolve Alistair. He had signed the incomplete schedules, surrendered his seal, ignored the warning about the reserves, and publicly accused Frances before examining the receipts. Vane had designed the fraud, but Alistair had supplied the authority that allowed it to operate. The government ordered a public inquiry for the following morning. Until it concluded, Ashcombe's warehouses and rental income would remain under temporary supervision. Cresswell also demanded payment on Alistair's private debts. His London residence and 2 unentailed properties were placed under claim. The political patrons who had welcomed Vane's promises refused to receive him. Alistair asked Thomas Harcourt for a temporary loan. Thomas declined. "My daughter's settlement has already fed the people your decisions endangered. It will not preserve the possessions you pledged for your ambition." Later, Alistair approached Frances. "If Cresswell takes the London house, the scandal will become permanent. The scandal became permanent when you accused me before 300 people. I was deceived. You were warned. I did not know Vane intended to seize the villages. But you knew I might have an explanation for the grain." Alistair could not deny it. He had seen Frances authorize emergency deliveries after the floods. He had also seen Bell injured beside the damaged ledger. He had chosen not to investigate because restoring Frances's authority would have made him appear dependent upon her. "What must I do?" he asked. "Tell the inquiry the truth." "That could cost me control of Ashcombe. You have already lost control. Tomorrow decides whether you will also lose the right to call yourself deceived." By evening, the tenants reached London. They assembled outside the building where the inquiry would be held, carrying the same empty sacks they had brought from Ashcombe. Their petition requested 3 things: cancellation of the fraudulent pledges, protection from eviction, and permanent independent oversight of the grain reserves. Frances agreed to present their evidence. Shortly before the hearing, Talbot received word that Sir Malcolm Vane had been found. He had not attempted to flee England. Instead, He had voluntarily appeared before the inquiry's officers carrying the missing second ledger and the original Eastern Provision Agreement. Vane claimed both documents proved that Duke Alistair had planned the entire scheme. He also named Duchess Frances as the person who had first proposed using the grain shortage to acquire the canal lands. When the hearing began, Vane entered under guard and placed the ledger on the commissioner's table. Then he produced a private agreement bearing Frances's signature. The agreement stated that Frances had authorized Vane to create a grain shortage, acquire the indebted farms, and divide the canal profits between them. It carried her signature and the seal once kept in her exchange office. Vane claimed Alistair discovered the scheme and dismissed his wife to protect Ashcombe. Frances requested permission to examine the document. It was dated May 3rd and instructed Vane to transfer the profits through Eastern Provision's account at Cresswell Bank. She placed the bank's deed register beside it. Eastern Provision was created on June 10th, she said. Its Cresswell account opened 2 days later. This agreement refers to both more than a month before either existed. Vane's counsel argued that the company might have been planned earlier. Then Sir Malcolm should explain how I knew its final account number, Frances replied. Cresswell did not assign that number until the account was opened. A bank director confirmed the date. The document was not merely invalid, it had been prepared after June 12th and falsely dated to make Frances appear involved from the beginning. Samuel Pike then examined the witness line. His name appeared beneath Frances's signature. "I never witnessed this," he testified. "I had not met the Duchess in May. Sir Malcolm first employed me in July. Pike also identified the handwriting in the second ledger. Vane had instructed him to duplicate the emergency deliveries under abandoned farms and later added Frances's name beside the missing 1,200 bushels. Bell presented the authentic October authorization. The Harcourt Dispatch Book, Miller's receipts, and Carter's records all confirmed that the grain had reached the flooded villages. The commissioners formally declared that no evidence supported Alistair's public accusation against his wife. Frances's name was cleared. The hearing then turned to Eastern Provision. Cresswell's deed register established Vane's control of the company. The false inventories supported grain contracts Ashcombe could not fulfill. The pledged villages and abandoned farms all lay along the proposed canal route. Vane had intended to export the reserves, raise local prices, and acquire the properties after families fell behind on rents and debts. His claim that Alistair designed the plan also began to collapse. Pike testified that Vane had filled in the quantities and collateral after receiving the Duke's incomplete schedules. The Cresswell officer confirmed that Alistair had not appeared in Eastern Provision's ownership register. But Vane's defense contained one truth. None of the fraud could have succeeded without Alistair's authority. The Duke had signed unfinished documents, surrendered control of the exchange, permitted Vane to use his seal, and continued exporting grain after Frances warned him that the reserves were insufficient. The commissioners asked him why he had dismissed her before reviewing the northern delivery receipts. "Sir Malcolm told me the missing grain proved she had exceeded her authority," Alistair said. Frances rose. "That is not a complete answer." The presiding commissioner allowed her to continue. "You saw me authorize those deliveries after the floods. You knew the missing page might contain a lawful explanation. Why did you summon 300 tenants before asking the northern millers a single question?" Alistair remained silent. The commissioner repeated the question. Vane had deceived him about the contracts, the company, and the canal lands, but no forged document had forced Alistair to hold a public accusation. No missing ledger page had required him to humiliate his wife before the people who trusted her. Outside, the Ashcombe tenants waited with their empty sacks. Inside, the commissioners ordered Alistair to answer under oath. If he lied, Bell, the Millers, and Frances could contradict him. If he told the truth, he would have to admit that he had suspected his wife might be innocent, and destroyed her publicly anyway. Alistair answered under oath. "I knew the grain might have been delivered lawfully," he admitted. "I had seen Frances authorize emergency supplies after the floods." "Then why did you accuse her?" the commissioner asked. "Because Ashcombe trusted her judgment more than mine." The answer silenced the chamber. Alistair continued. "Sir Malcolm told me that unless I removed her publicly, the tenants and merchants would believe she controlled the estate. I wanted to prove that my authority was greater. I signed documents she had warned me not to sign, and I used the missing page as an excuse to disgrace her." "Did Sir Malcolm force you to do any of those things?" "No." Alistair then admitted that he had seen Bell injured and still refused to delay the accusation. He had also signed incomplete schedules because Vane promised profits, relief from his private debts, and political influence. "Sir Malcolm deceived me about Eastern provision," he said, "but he did not make me betray my wife. That choice was mine." His testimony destroyed Vane's final defense. If Alistair had created the scheme, he would not have needed false inventories, forged agreements, or contracts completed without his knowledge. The commissioners ordered Vane held for trial on charges arising from fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to obtain land through false debts. Pike and Bell were placed under protection as witnesses. The two Cresswell officials who had assisted Eastern Provision were referred for separate investigation. The inquiry did not deliver an immediate criminal conviction. It secured the records and sent the case to the proper court. The fraudulent claims against the farms and villages were suspended. No family could be evicted until each debt had been reviewed independently. Then the commissioners addressed Alistair. He had not designed Vane's scheme, but his conduct had endangered thousands of people. He had allowed estate reserves to secure private borrowing, surrendered his seal, and continued shipments without verifying whether Ashcombe could fulfill them. The commission therefore recommended that Ashcombe's finances, warehouses, and tenant reserves remain under independent supervision. Alistair would retain his title, but he would no longer control the grain exchange or pledge village income without trustee approval. His promised political position was formally withdrawn. Outside, the decision was read to the tenants. They lowered their empty sacks only after learning that the eviction claims had been suspended. Inside, Alistair made one final statement. "My wife did not steal 1,200 bushels. She delivered them to the flooded villages under lawful authority. I accused her without proof because I resented the respect she had earned." He requested that the correction be printed and distributed in every Ashcombe village. Frances accepted the public vindication, but offered him no comfort. After the hearing, Alistair approached her. "I will transfer the exchange to your trustees permanently. It should never have depended upon your permission. I know that now. You know it because the commission removed your authority. That is not the same as understanding it when you still possessed power." Alistair accepted the rebuke. His London residence and 2 unentailed properties would be sold to satisfy creditors and repay the relief trust. Frances's settlement remained protected, but she refused to use it to preserve the Ashcombe possessions he had pledged. "What will happen to us?" he asked. "That is no longer the first question I must answer." She instructed her solicitor to prepare a formal deed of separation. Her residence, income, and commercial decisions would remain independent of Alistair. He would have no authority over the exchange or her settlement. Alistair did not challenge the terms. Several weeks later, Frances returned to Ashcombe. The investigation had verified the remaining reserves, the relief depots were still operating, and the government had postponed the canal decision until the affected farms were protected. 300 workers gathered inside the exchange, the same number who had witnessed her expulsion. Alistair waited beside the counting table with the iron ring of 7 keys. He did not stand on the raised platform. "These belong to you," he said. Frances looked at the keys, but did not take them from his hand. Before reopening the exchange, she intended to make certain that no Duke, Alistair or any successor, could ever seize it from its workers and villages again. Frances had already secured the trustees' approval for a new governing charter. The Ashcombe Grain Exchange would no longer answer to the Duke alone. Its board would include 2 settlement trustees, 2 elected tenant representatives, 2 millers, and an independent merchant. Frances would serve as director, but emergency reserves could be released only through recorded votes and publicly available accounts. No warehouse, wagon, or grain reserve could be pledged against Alistair's private debts. She placed the charter on the counting table. "These are the conditions under which the exchange will reopen." Alistair read the document before signing it. This time he examined every page. When he finished, he held out the iron ring. Frances did not take it. "Place the keys on the table." He obeyed. Only after he stepped away did Frances pick them up. The reversal was witnessed by the same workers who had seen Alistair force her to surrender them. He had once made her stand below him while he claimed everything she built. Now he possessed neither the platform nor the authority to return it as a favor. "My public correction has been printed in every village," he said. "The proceeds from the London house will repay the Relief Trust. Restitution is required," Frances replied. "It does not purchase forgiveness." "I understand." She presented him with the completed deed of separation. Her residence, income, settlement, and commercial decisions would remain independent. Alistair would live on a smaller western property after his creditors completed their claims. He signed without asking her to reconsider. Months later, Vane was convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to obtain the canal properties through false debts. His assets were used to compensate the injured clerks and families affected by the manipulated grain prices. The Cresswell officials who assisted Eastern Provision were dismissed and separately prosecuted. Samuel Pike received leniency for cooperating with the investigation. Bell returned as chief clerk after recovering from his injuries. Clara supervised the relief depots, which became permanent safeguards against future harvest failures. The canal proposal was eventually reconsidered, with protections for the affected farms. No tenant could be forced to surrender land through the debts Eastern Provision had manufactured. Alistair retained his title, but Ashcombe's finances remained under supervision. He lost his political prospects, his London residence, 2 properties, and the right to manage the institution that had once sustained his authority. More importantly, the tenants no longer mistook his rank for sound judgment. On the first market morning after the exchange reopened, Harcourt wagons entered Ashcombe carrying grain into the county. Every delivery was weighed, witnessed, and entered into ledgers available for inspection. Frances unlocked the first warehouse. Across the road, Alistair stood among the tenants rather than above them. He had once believed possession was the same as authority. The warehouses still carried the Ashcombe crest. The villages still belonged to his estate, and the title remained his. Yet no wagon moved at his command. No merchant accepted an unsigned promise. No family depended upon his permission to receive emergency grain. Frances turned the seventh key and opened the exchange doors. 300 workers and tenants entered the institution she had rebuilt. She did not look back to see whether Alistair regretted losing her. His regret belonged to him. The future of Ashcombe no longer did.